Before he was Stalin, he called himself Koba, the name of a noble bandit hero in a Georgian novel he loved as a boy. The man who would go on to erase national identities across the Soviet Union built his own out of the very culture his empire later tried to bury. It didn't just draw the borders, it wrote the names. And today, from the Caucasus to Central Asia, the countries it renamed are taking those names back. Countries that spent generations having their names, their languages, even their histories assigned to them by Moscow, and are now choosing for themselves. This is decolonization, and it happens to be written on a map. I'm Bruce Pannier. I spent 4 decades covering the former Soviet Union. This is Turan Research Center, hosted by the Yorktown Institute, where we break down the geopolitics of Turkey, Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. If you're new here and want more analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's get into it.
Внимание! Говорит и показывает Москва.
To understand why a name change is a strategic act, you have to understand what Soviet naming was actually for. It was never decoration. It was administration. When Moscow named a place, it was doing 3 things at once: encoding an ideology, asserting that the land and its language belonged to the center, and quietly erasing whatever the place had been called before. Take encoding ideology at its most literal. For 3 decades, the capital of Tajikistan wasn't Dushanbe, it was Stalinabad, Stalin's city. And its second city, Khojand, a place with more than 2,000 years of history, spent over half a century as Leninabad, one of the oldest cities in Central Asia, relabeled as a monument to the men in Moscow. And the way they came back tells you something. Dushanbe shed Stalin's name in 1961 once his cult had collapsed, even inside the Soviet Union. Khojand carried Leninabad all the way to 1991 and took its own name back the moment independence arrived.
Освоение целинных земель, поднятие урожая, поднятие, так сказать, создание условий, так сказать, получения в изобилии продуктов питания и ширпотреба.
In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev launched the Virgin Lands campaign, recruiting hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian farmers to plow northern Kazakhstan's steppe. Look again at the capital in Kazakhstan, Virgin Land City. Think about what that phrase claims. That the steppe was empty, unclaimed, waiting for outsiders to give it purpose. There were people there. There had been for millennia. The name wrote them out. So, when Kazakhstan turns Ust-Kamenogorsk back into Ust-Kamen, or Uralsk back into Ural, it isn't taking a swing at Russia, it's resetting the default, declaring that Kazakh language and Kazakh memory are the baseline here, not the exception. And that matters most precisely where it's hardest. For a country with a long Russian border, a large Russian-speaking population, and a national language the Soviet system spent decades sidelining, the map is one of the few levers of identity it fully controls. Renaming is nation building. You can do with a signpost. Now, Ukraine is the version that you've heard about. Since the full-scale invasion, it's pulled Soviet and Russian names off cities and hundreds of streets. And it's pushed the West to write Kiev instead of Kiev.
Many international media outlets changed their spelling from Kiev to Kyiv, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Telegraph, and BBC.
That's the loudest case, but it's not the origin and it's not the heart of the story. This was happening across the region long before 2022, in countries that get along with Moscow and countries that don't, which tells you it isn't a war reflex, it's something more deliberate. And the clearest examples sit south of Russia, in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Start with how deep the imperial layer goes. Deep enough that you've probably been speaking it without noticing. You've probably heard the name Nagorno-Karabakh. Here's what almost nobody mentions. Half of it is Russian. Karabakh is centuries-old Turkic Persian for black garden. Nagorno, meaning mountainous, was bolted on in the 1920s when the Soviet planners redo the Caucasus. A genuinely indigenous name with an imperial qualifier stapled onto the front. The whole dynamic compressed into a single hyphen.
To Nagorno-Karabakh now.
Nagorno-Karabakh. Breakaway Nagorno-Karabakh.
Of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yet all the same, Nagorno-Karabakh remains the preference for most mainstream Western media, despite the objections of those who actually live there. And sometimes what was Soviets erased wasn't even Russian rivalry, it was faith or memory. A village the Soviets called Kazbegi got its original name back in 2006, Stepansminda, Saint Stephen. The Soviet renaming had scrubbed the religious meaning out. Restoring it scrubbed the scrub. But that old name carries an irony that says everything about how total the system was. Kazbegi honored a 19th century Georgian novelist. One of his novels has a noble bandit hero named Koba. A young Georgian named Joseph Jugashvili loved that character so much he adopted Koba as his first revolutionary alias years before he became Stalin. So, the man who would industrialize the erasure of national identity across the Soviet Union drew his earliest self-image from the Georgian literature his own state later worked to bury. The empire didn't just suppress these cultures, it fed on them, and then renamed what was left. And naming was only half the craft. The other half was the borders. The same planners who wrote the labels drew the internal lines, and drew them to keep Moscow indispensable. South Ossetia tucked inside Soviet Georgia. Abkhazia made its own republic. Each arrangement aimed a grievance at a neighbor instead of at the center, so that the only referee who could ever calm things down sat in Moscow. Karabakh, the Black Garden, with the Russian word in front, was one piece of the same design. Naming and bordering were the same tool. Reclaiming the names is the first, cheapest way to start undoing it. The region, for the most part, isn't doing this at Russia. It's doing it for itself. But you can measure how much these names mattered by how badly losing them stings. In July 2021, months before the invasion, Putin published an essay calling Russians and Ukrainians one people, sharing one historical and spiritual space, and complaining that Soviet border drawing meant Russia was robbed, not a history paper, a claim of ownership. You can measure how much these names matter by how far down they reach. This year, a village of just over 3,000 people outside Bishkek voted to shed its Russian-era name, Dmitrievka, given by settlers in the late 1800s, and take the name of an 18th century local noble who once wintered on the land.
Тарыхка баа берип, тарыхты урматтап, кече ким элем дегенди эске алуу менен мен бул чечим немени сунушту бул эсиркемиш атына өзгөрүүсүн колдойм. Да, бизде көп улуттуу айылбыз, түшүнбөстүктүн айынан каршы чыккандар болуп атат.
It wasn't unanimous. The vote split the village. Some residents say they were never properly consulted, and the case is still grinding through Kyrgyzstan's bureaucracy. And the reaction runs all the way up to the Russian Duma.
И уже 15 населенных пунктов, которые носили советские русские названия, были переименованы. В Бишкеке переименовали улицу Горького, Толстого, Гоголя, Фрунзе, Молодой гвардии. То есть, получается, мы стираем названия русские и советские в Киргизии. 15 миллиардов рублей воюющая страна дает сейчас Киргизии. А нельзя ли какую-то опцию во всех этих соглашениях иметь такую, чтобы, по крайней мере, мы были защищены от русофобии и антисоветизма, который процветает в этих республиках? Как вы объясняете вообще целесообразность всего этого с учетом исчезновения русских названий в населенных пунктах и улицах Киргизии?
The same reflex runs through Russian media. When Kazakhstan merely respelled a few railway stations in Kazakhstan, Ural instead of Uralsk, TV host Tina Kandalaki branded it as a dangerous tendency and an attack on the Russian language. Kazakhstan's answer was to bar her from the country. And when Kyrgyz Village made its move, one Russian outlet read it as proof that Moscow's soft power had collapsed, that its own allies were scrubbing every Russian trace they could find. A respilled train station, a village of 3,000, treated in Moscow as strategic losses. That's the tell. These were never just labels. And the same worldview shows up far from any front line, wherever a country drifts from Russian as the default. In April 2025, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited a war memorial in Samarkand and pointedly noted that the inscription appeared in Uzbek and English, but not Russian.
Как вам англичан занесло?
Англичан, имеется в виду,
пьесу.
Я посмотрю по-английски там надпись. Где это?
Это на всех языках, в принципе. Город туризма, поэтому посещают этих памятников.
Русского не вижу.
Uzbekistan heard it exactly as intended, a former master telling them what their own monument should say. Around the same time, Tashkent introduced a mandatory Uzbek language exam for graduates. Toward Kazakhstan, it's been blunter. In 2014, Putin claimed the Kazakhs never had statehood before the Soviet Union, the kind of line Russian nationalists used to float claims on Kazakhstan's Russian-speaking north.
Назарбаев очень грамотный руководитель. Он же создал государство на территории, на которой государства не было никогда. У казахов не было государственности никогда. Он ее создал.
This festival in Astana is just one of some 100 events across Kazakhstan marking the 550th anniversary of the Kazakh Khanate.
Astana's answer was its own act of map-making, a national celebration of the 550th anniversary of the Kazakh Khanate. Translation: we had a state 4 centuries before you arrived.
В Казахстане история Золотой Орды рассматривается как сложный, многомерный период в мировой летописи. Упрощать данное обстоятельство ни в коем случае не следует, ибо это неизбежно приведет к линейному взгляду на это уникальное явление мировой истории, что чревато историческими ошибками, которые, в свою очередь, могут сдетонировать добрые отношения между государствами и народами. К сожалению, подобные случаи, связанные с различной трактовкой крупных исторических событий мирового значения, мы уже наблюдаем.
That's the pattern. These countries are looking inward, building identity. Moscow keeps reading it as betrayal, because for the Kremlin, language and naming were never neutral either. They were instruments of control, and control is exactly what's slipping. And so here's the takeaway for Washington, and it's subtler than these countries are joining our side. The renaming wave isn't really about alignment. It's a hard-won assertion of independence by nations that spent generations having their identity defined for them. Read it as a signal of agency. These are middle powers, making their own choices, not pieces moving on someone else's board. Which is why the names we use carry weight. Every time an American official, or an outlet, or a map defaults to the old Russian spelling, it quietly refiles these countries in Russia's backyard, and endorses the claim that they aren't fully sovereign in the first place. Fix costs nothing. Using the names these countries choose for themselves isn't a favor or a reward. It's a recognition that they got to name their own places and that they're more than someone else's near abroad. We spend a lot of time on this channel tracking the obvious levers of influence: pipelines, corridors, armies, churches. The quietest lever is the map itself. And across the former Soviet world, people are picking it up and redrawing it, one name at a time. Thanks for watching. This video is based on an analysis by Joseph Epstein for the Atlantic Council. I'll leave the link in the description if you want to read the full piece. If you found this video informative, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. And let me know in the comments, when a country reclaims its own names, is that real sovereignty or symbolism while the harder battles play out elsewhere? I'd like to hear your take.